What's up, guys? My name is Dr. Antonio with Live Loud Chiropractic and Coaching. We are based out of Lafayette, Colorado, which is here in Boulder County. Today, what we're going to be going over is a series of hip drills that will help improve your mobility and your stability. What we're also trying to articulate here is how to create dexterity around the hip. When we have dexterity, that means we have more control. And creating more control allows us to have better movement and better movement awareness depending on various activities. So more times than not, what we see out of the hip is we assume we move the leg kind of around the body, which is important, but some of these drills are going to show how we can move the body about the hip, which is really important for sports and performance, because a lot of these rotational movements or other movements are going to be our torso and our hips moving around our stable hip, which is planted into the ground. So we're going to show you these exercises in series and explain on how you can go about them and how they can help your hip mobility and stability. Okay, so the hip airplane we can do in a couple different ways. Now, the main thing I want you to think about is when we're doing a lot of, just movements around the hip, the leg is moving, right, with or around the pelvis, right, or the torso. Here, what we're going to be talking about or showing is, can we control the body moving around the hip? So we have a couple tools here that we're going to utilize to help us if balance is an issue and something that we need that might help us a little bit. But we're going to first start with a split stance. So a split stance simply means 1 foot forwards, 1 foot backwards. From here, I'm going to bias and try to put the majority of my weight in this front leg, and this back toe is simply just touching the ground for a little bit of balance. So here, what we're going to practice is just opening and closing the hip. So this leg, ideally, toes are pointing straight towards you at the camera. This hip, ideally, the knee is staying in line with the toes when pointing with you. But you can see how my torso is rotating around. So what we wouldn't want is if I'm falling this way, my knee comes in, or as I'm coming out, that knee is pushing out this way. I'm trying to maintain some rigidity and planting this through the ground, and I'm going to spin around. So what I'm thinking about is my pubic bone and my sternum opening away and then closing towards. Opening away, closing towards. I'm not twisting through my back because I want this whole system to come with me. Okay, so on the other side, looks the same. Close, open. Now, this is the first step to help you get or to do this movement so that you understand what the movement is. Now, ideally, what we're going to build up to is being able to do this, right, without any help or control as such. I need a little bit of practice here. So what you can do is use a foam roller. You could use a countertop or something like that to help you balance so that we can create that first stepping stone into understanding the movement. So from here, if I can do both hands or one, I'm going to reach my heel and my hand away from each other. Okay, same thing. I'm going to open away from the leg, and then I'm going to come down and close towards the leg. Now, actually, what's nice too is you actually feel a nice big stretch in the hip musculature there, and then I'm going to come up. You can see my wobble here. Dr. Antonio needs a little bit of practice as I come up and down through here. Okay? Now, again, another tool that you can use, I don't have a squat rack in here, is you can put a plate on your squat rack, and you can use that for balance and rotate on that plate as it's anchored into a barbell or whatever rack that you have, okay? Now, again, the importance is the control of my torso moving around the fixed point. This is important for a lot of sports and activities that we do because a lot of what we do is planting a foot and then everything else rotates around that fixed leg, okay? So these are hip airplanes. Again, this is not intended to be done fast or sloppy, right? This is about control. This is about creating dexterity and improving mobility, especially if you're finding that in one of these planes of motion you feel a little tighter, you can actually hang out there a little bit and get a stretch. Or when I open up, if I'm feeling that inner leg kind of restricting, I can open up to create a little bit more of a stretch, allowing me to release whatever's restricting me to open up the range of motion and control, okay? Hip airplanes, they're not doing them, give it a try. They're super beneficial for good hip health. So the windmill, what we're gonna be doing is focusing on creating like torsion or torque within the hip, but within that, we oftentimes think of torsion as tight. We think of torsion as creating lines of tension where we want lines of tension, and then releasing and opening where we don't want it, right? So our classic windmill, which we see most of the time online, the feet are maintaining a fixed position, and then we're rotating whichever direction from there. Now, this can be a great mobility test, which as seen, I actually learned this from a previous colleague of mine, Dr. Jordan Shallow with Prescript. He uses it as a test because by fixing this, we really get a true understanding of thoracic rotation and hip rotation. And that's true and that's good, but I like using it where I'm in a more open position for the actual mobility drill, right? I don't like fixing it because, again, primarily my patients not being as performance-based, where they're having a lot more range of motion restrictions, I don't want to put their shoulders in precarious positions or create too much tension in an area that needs to move. So what we're going to focus on is our feet are going to move opposite to the direction or the hand that's going to have the weight. Now we're going to start body weight first, meaning it's just my arm up. I don't want load yet, but you can see how my toes turn. Now, the most important part of this movement, just like when we do a hinge, my butt moves away from my toes or in the same direction of my heels. The same goes true here. So if I'm square to you and I turn 45, I do not want my hips moving this way. My hips should be moving away from my toes in this diagonal fashion that we've just created. Now, a cue that's very helpful is taking this arm, the front leg arm, or the down arm, and trying to slide your forearm down your thigh towards your inner shin or your kind of medial calf or inner calf. Okay, so one hand comes up, opposite to the front leg. This slides down just like we said, and notice my hips shift away. Now, the majority of the weight is on your front. You can even bend the toes on the back a little bit if you want, but what this allows me to do is to sit into that front hip more to work the mobility and the stability of that front hip, okay? Again, those go hand in hand. When we're trying to create stability, we have to have a certain amount of mobility. And in order for that mobility to happen, we have to feel oftentimes very comfortable with the stability in that hip. So that's why we're talking about both of these processes together. So again, when I go down, now what you're also going to see my, because the hips are shifting, you're going to see my torso turn a little bit. So while my knees are facing in this diagonal fashion this way, right, to the kind of diagonally to the right, my torso is going to square up to the front of you, which creates a lot of mobility around that hip because again, my pelvis is now turning around my hip. Now I'm also testing and working on thoracic rotation, which is good as part of the test we had just indicated. And then if I have weight above me, that's why I'm working on that shoulder stability as well. But from a mobility perspective with the hip, we can now change that toe variation angle to coil and create more tension. As Dr. Shallow I had mentioned for Dr. Shallow with Prescript, by squaring up and then doing mine, I really am going to challenge the amount of hip rotation that we see, and even more so, challenge the amount of thoracic rotation as well. So if this is, again, 0 degrees or square, and I was at 45, maybe I'll turn to like 30 and test it where I feel now that hip is challenged and coiled just a little bit more. I like doing these in sets and reps. I tend to not do them crazy heavy just because I am working on it from more of a thoracic rotation and hip mobility perspective. You can definitely load it up a little bit heavier if you really want to challenge shoulder stability and some other factors as well, but that's what I tend to see. So what I'll try to do is I'll get weight overhead. Right now I'm going light. Again, light, this is, what is this, 8 kilos, right? I tend to do this anywhere between 12, 16, and maybe 20 kilos. And then I'm just gonna do some easy movements, and then I might find, oh, this one's a little tight. I'm gonna sit into that hip a little bit more, and then I'll come up. And when I'm down there too, I'm kind of playing around and just wiggling to see where I might need to focus a little more time and attention, right? This is the windmill, right? Can be done with kettlebell, could be done with the dumbbell, or just body weight as well. But it's a fantastic exercise for challenging, first and foremost, yes, shoulder stability, but what I really love it for is really a spinal mobility movement and a hip mobility movement that really helps open up the hips. So to break down the Turkish Get Up Windmill, this is a stage or a certain step within the Turkish Get Up that a lot of times gets overlooked, passed over, but in my opinion is great for challenging mobility and stability and keeping us honest, but to also just work on a positioning. A lot of times we can't progress with the Turkish Get Up just because we're missing certain stages that are super advantageous for stacking yourself appropriately to then transition into the next phase so that you can get up, right? So we're gonna do it first body weight, okay? So if I'm here, this is one stage of the Turkish Get Up. Whether I'm going down or up, I'm gonna be in this lunge pattern. Now what's important is if I'm coming down or up, this middle phase, I need to square my hips. What does that mean? One toe is pointing in one direction and the back toe is facing another direction. Or my knees are facing 90 degrees away from each other. What this allows me to do is to sit the down knee, it allows me to sit that hip towards that back heel, allowing me to hinge down into the movement. Now this right here is where the mobility comes in. So a lot of people with tight hips, you're gonna see that that front knee or that top knee collapse down, right? And we wanna try to keep all that stacked. So now I'm challenging that 90-degree shape that I had, and I'm also starting to open up and challenge that downward knee or inner thigh as I hinge and turn. So this is the windmill within the Turkish Get Up that we're talking about. So I'll stage this for myself, for clients or patients, as just practicing what this feels like to just work on hip mobility and stability in a different context. Because right now, if I'm starting to fall in as I go back and forth, we're seeing where that tension is wanting to pull you in and where we're biased to not being able to load as appropriately. So we're just gonna practice this first without weight, coming up and down, loading into that hip, and coiling up and down, starting to loosen up both hips extremely well. So from a different view, I'm just gonna turn this 90, so for those of you who are watching can see. Now you can see this bottom knee is in line with you, front knee is 90 degrees. So right now, if I'm facing you, right, as you see me come down, you're gonna see that sternum turn to the side. So this is where there's a lot of great mobility challenges, yes, in the thoracic spine, but I'm also really working through and coiling that hip, and I'm feeling a nice stretch on that inner thigh on both sides, but more so from that down hip as it sits away and turns, okay? So this is the windmill within the Turkish Get Up. That's a critical component that most people forget or miss. I'm gonna show one more time here just to show the transition for down and up to where this stage hits to make sure that you're hitting it appropriately. So let's say, for instance, I'm coming down, I'm gonna lunge back, I'm gonna windshield wiper my top foot or up foot so that my knees are at a 90-degree angle. I'm gonna sit this bottom hip back towards my heel, slide the hand down and away. The hand comes in line with the knee, and that's when this comes through. So if I have the weight in hand, windshield wiper, sit this back, hand comes down. Now I'm in the position to kick that leg through, and then I would reverse down. On the way up, it's the same thing. Once I've come up to my hand, I'm gonna pull that knee through, but it's gotta open up at 90 degrees to the top so I can pull my leg through into that windmill. Sit the hip back, pop up, windshield wiper the leg around, and then we're gonna stand, okay? So again, this is the windshield wiper position, the windmill position within the Turkish Get Up to challenge mobility, not only in the thoracic spine, definitely in the hips, but also challenging the stability of the shoulder as well, okay? Now, the goblet squat, as many of you may know, is one of my favorite exercises. The goblet squat, the double kettlebell front rack, I feel that it is a great teacher for teaching the squat pattern, but also showing and challenging how we integrate core stability. But it is also really good as a hip mobility drill because it puts you in a position where you're loaded. That helps you get down into that deep position where you can kind of offset that weight. But because you can get your elbows down inside of your knees, you can start to pry your hips open to use it as a mobility drill. So this is the prying goblet squat. So all you're gonna do, you're gonna take a weight, right? Bring it up like we normally would for a goblet squat. Okay, I'm gonna show you in this face view here. And then we're gonna simply squat down. And notice, I hold it away from me because that's gonna allow me to stay more upright. Whereas if it was closer, depending on your mobility, you might be tipped forward, making this harder. But now I can wedge those elbows in between my knees and start to just kind of bob and weave and shift and pry open to stretch those inner thighs and that inner hip. Okay? Now I like, again, shifting side to side, rocking on toes, rocking on heels, lifting butt, dropping butt, just to find just various shapes and positions of the hips that might be tighter. Okay? So we'll come back up, show you from a side view here. So you can see how far away I'm letting that kettlebell kind of travel from my chest. So we'll squat down. Okay, so you can see that. I'm pretty low. Now again, you're gonna see a tail drop or a butt wink or a low back slightly rounding. I'm not real heavy here where it's a concern. I'm more so just trying to use it for mobility. Now, you could try to maintain a straight back and still do the same thing, completely valid. We're just showing that if we wanna try to get into this position, to use the elbows to open up the hips, to widen that space, to create more mobility. This is something that we cue consistently when working on the squat pattern. Oftentimes, our squat patterns turn poor where we're leaning forward or something, not always because we have poor mobility. Sometimes we're just too narrow and we're not able to utilize hip range of motion. So we're trying to find that squat stance and enhance that range of motion by prying the hips open. So what we mean by prying is if my two ball and socket joints and the femurs move away from each other, now I have more space for my torso and pelvis essentially to sit down in between, which helps me keep some more upright squat pattern, which will help in performance lifts such as front squats, overhead squats, even back squats depending on the position of the bar. So prying goblet squat, a fantastic mobility drill. Now, yes, you need to have a certain amount of mobility to even get down into there. So you might need to utilize a lot of the other hip mobility drills that we have in order to first get there, because we don't want anyone to sacrifice or create any issues by forcing yourself down low enough just to get your elbows in. So you do have to take that consideration. Cool? All right, goblet squat or prying goblet squat. Use it as a good mobility drill. Use it as a great warm-up before your squats or any of your other workouts, because I know it will be beneficial for you.